Chapter 057 Unwanted. Zorian stared intently at the 2 sheets of paper in front of him, methodically going through every single line of text and marking down the matches and differences between the 2 documents. Zack sat beside him, watching him work with a thoughtful frown, not saying anything. Despite the oppressive silence and serious mood, the 2 papers were simple lists of names. Classmates, teachers, public officials. Each of them had listed anyone they considered even remotely important on their own sheet of paper, with no input from the other whatsoever. It was Zorian's hope that by comparing the 2 lists with each other, they could see if there were any other obvious holes in Zack's memory. Or Zorian's memory, for that matter. It was unlikely, but Zorian didn't entirely discount the idea that his own mind had been tempered with 2. "Is this really necessary?" Zack asked him. "Maybe I just forgot the guy." Zorian looked up from the 2 papers to give Zack an incredulous look. "Hey, I'm just saying," Zack protested. "I mean, it has been a pretty long time since I've been stuck in this time loop, and he was expelled before the time loop even began. I'd have to specifically seek him out, and what reason did I have to do that? We apparently didn't even like each other, if I understood you correctly." "Please," Zorian scoffed. There was no doubt in Zorian's mind that Zack's curious inability to remember anything about Veyer's Boranova was artificial in nature. "I can understand you putting the jerk completely out of your mind. Hell, I pretty much did that myself. But to completely forget that he existed at all and everything about him? Yet that was precisely what happened, if Zack was to be believed. Zorian could only conclude someone had scrubbed Zack's mind clean of everything related to the Boranova heir. He wasn't sure why Zack was so unwilling to accept that conclusion, though he did have his suspicions. Zorian returned to his task of matching names for a while, eventually stumbling onto a name on Zack's list that he was unfamiliar with. That was not very surprising, though. Zack's list was way longer than Zorian's, as the other boy was far more social than he was. "Who is this Aluminum Chem guy?" he asked Zack. "He was a student in one of the other groups during our first 2 years in the academy," Zack said. "We used to hang out together sometimes. You weren't very friendly back then, so that's probably why you don't remember him. I don't think you ever mingled with the other groups, did you?" "No," Zorian admitted. "I was always very busy back then. I barely interacted with my own classmates, never mind people I had no reason to talk to. Still, I did take a brief look at the other groups, back when I was investigating our classmates for potential Red Robe candidates. I don't remember ever seeing any Aluminum Chem." "Well, I did say he was a student," Zack pointed out. "He failed the certification exam and dropped out of the academy." "Well, that would explain it. He had completely ignored people who failed to advance into the 3rd year, thinking them irrelevant. That's how he missed Veyers too, actually. We're going to have to make a list of people like that and see if it holds any more surprises for us," Zorian noted. Scanning the names below Aluminum, he noticed quite a few names from other student groups. "That said, I can't help but notice that you know quite a few students outside our class." "I know what you're getting at," Zack interrupted him. "You're going to point out how I can list half of our year mates on demand but can't remember a guy that went to our class. And?" Zorian prodded. "Your response to that? You're right. There's definitely something abnormal about me forgetting this Veyers guy like that. You happy now?" Zack said resignedly. "Yes," Zorian nodded. "Now tell me who this Annik Saprovowski girl is." For the next hour and a half, they slowly went through the 2 lists of names, searching for any peculiarities. The good news was that Zack didn't have any other glaring holes in his memories, as far as Zorian could tell. Only Veyers seemed to be a total blank. "So, do you think Veyers is Red Robe?" Zack asked cautiously. "That's the question, isn't it?" Zorian said, taking off his glasses and inspecting them for dirt. It was mostly a way to waste some time while he thought about what he wanted to say. "Yes it is," said Zack slowly, as if talking to an idiot. "So why don't you try answering it?" "Ugh. So impatient." "It's possible," Zorian said. "But I don't know. I'm kind of bothered by some things about this, Like what? Zack asked curiously. Like the fact Vayers apparently wiped only himself out of your memory, Zorian said. That is so amateurish. I would expect more from Red Robe. I mean, if it was me doing something like this, I would have blanked out your recollection of another 4 or 5 random students to muddy the trail a bit. Zack gave him an unamused look. You know, Zorian, sometimes I can't help but wonder if you're actually Red Robe, he said. You saw both of us in the same room, though, Zorian pointed out, completely unconcerned by Zack's words. I already know Red Robe can make simulacrums, so that proves nothing, Zack said, folding his hands over his chest. Zorian made a mental note to ask Zack to teach him how to cast the simulacrum spell, since it was unlikely that Zack had never learned the spell in all the decades he had spent in the time loop, and Zorian really wanted the spell. They had more pressing issues at the moment, however, so he reluctantly set the idea aside for the moment. The second thing that bothers me is that it's hard to swallow that someone like Vayers could be the relatively discreet and patient Red Robe, Zorian said, dragging the conversation back to the topic of Vayers. I mean, he lost his temper at a disciplinary hearing, for God's sake. He is even more impulsive than you are. Hey! Zack protested. Then again, neither of us are very similar to the person we used to be before the time loop, are we? Admitted Zorian. There are plenty of similarities, Zack said, shaking his head in disagreement. But I do think that him having a short fuse before the time loop proves little. You were also rather unpleasant to interact with before the time loop, and look at you now. This was probably payback for Zorian's earlier comment about Zack's impulsiveness. He supposed he did kind of deserve that. I had reasons for behaving like I did, Zorian noted. Who says Vayers didn't? Zack asked. I'm sure he felt his behavior was totally justified, too. That was true, Zorian conceded. In fact, it could be that the nature of the time loop removed most of Vayers' problems and allowed him to calm down. Much like it did for Zorian himself. I suppose you're right, said Zorian after a pause. He shook his head to clear his thoughts a little. I think that, in the end, it doesn't really matter whether Vayers is Red Robe or not. The fact you have no memory of him means he's someone Red Robe didn't want you to interact with, which makes him automatically important. We have to check him out. Oh, no argument about that, Zack nodded. Though this makes me wonder. If Vayers really is Red Robe, what will we find when we track him down? Depending on what method Red Robe used to leave the time loop, we would expect his counterparts in this world to be either a soulless corpse like the Ernia or an unaware person no different from the rest of the people around us, Zorian said. Why a soulless corpse? Zack asked, baffled. Well, I've been thinking of the ways Red Robe could have tricked the Guardian into letting him out of the time loop reality, and I realized he might have just asked for his soul to be shoved into his real-world body, explained Zorian. For a necromancer like him, it might be fairly trivial to just eject his old soul out of the body and continue as normal from there. Would the Guardian agree to do that, though? Zack asked. Can it even do that? It did claim it would have to switch souls if the body in the real world already has one. I can't give you an answer to any of that, obviously, Zorian huffed. I don't know enough about either necromancy or the Guardian's capabilities to say if it's possible. It's just an idea I've been considering, that's all. For a while, they kept throwing various possibilities at each other. It was all just wild speculation, however, so they gave up on that discussion as pointless soon enough. They would have to wait until they found Vayers before they could properly consider the issue. A brief silence descended between them, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Are you sure you don't want me to take a look at your mind? Asked Zorian after a while. What? Zack asked with incomprehension, jolted out of his musings by Zorian's question. A second later, when he finally processed the question, his face contorted into an annoyed glare. No. Absolutely not. I'm sorry, but I already had my brain scrambled by one mind mage and I don't want to be at the mercy of another. Besides, what would be the point? I may not be an expert on mind magic like you, but even I know there is no way to restore magically erased memories. I'd be letting you rummage through my mind for nothing. Well, it's true that a properly blanked-out memory is irrecoverable, Zorian admitted easily. But why assume Red Robe executed the mind wipe flawlessly? I saw his mind magic in action at one point, when he tried to use it against me, and he wasn't all that good with it. There is a good chance he missed something. You have a very skewed image of what constitutes as good when it comes to mind magic, Zack told him. It's not Red Robe that's bad, it's you who is terrifyingly good at it. And the answer is still no. What if I tell you that you could still be under the magic's influence? Zorian asked. Zack gave him a surprised look. What the hell do you mean by that? Zack asked him with a raised voice. It's hard to believe you never encountered anyone mentioning Vayers in one of the previous restarts, Zorian pointed out with a sigh. He's not often mentioned, but people do talk about him on occasion. At some point over the decades, you really should have noticed there was a guy everyone in our class knew of, yet you have no memories of. Well, I was only rarely in class after some point. Zack tried. Zack, you've been strangely evasive about Vayers this entire time, Zorian told him bluntly. Hell, not long ago you again floated the idea you may have just forgotten the guy. As if it hadn't been abundantly obvious by then that the guy had been purposely deleted out of your memories. I would have expected you to be excited about discovering something so important, but instead you seemed really keen to dismiss the whole thing. Zorian, you're overcomplicating things again, Zack complained. Please speak plainly. Fine. You're probably under some kind of compulsion not to focus on the topic of theirs, Zorian said. And possibly forget about it after a while, if it was ever forcibly pointed out to you. We'll have to see if you still remember this conversation tomorrow. Don't even joke about that last part, Zorian, Zack warned him. It's what I'd have done in Red Robe's place, Zorian said, shrugging. But I have a feeling you don't have to worry about that. If Red Robe didn't bother masking his memory wipe better, it's likely that he didn't bother with something so relatively sophisticated. The compulsion to dismiss the topic itself might have been enough, anyway. I mean, if it hadn't been for me being so pushy and insistent about the hole in your memory when it comes to theirs, you'd have likely dismissed it and eventually put it out of your mind. Zack hissed something under his breath that Zorian didn't quite catch but which he was pretty sure were insults and swear words directed at Red Robe. Something about his canine ancestry and fondness for male genitals. Regardless, Zack spent the next several minutes pacing around the area and muttering to himself. He looked dangerously unstable, if Zorian was to be perfectly honest. And it wasn't the first time Zack had done something like that, either. It occurred to Zorian that all those decades Zack spent in the time loop, with only limited ability to interact with other people, must have been harder on his fellow time traveler than he had supposed. How much worse, then, would he have ended up if the time loop worked as intended and he stayed inside for hundreds of years or however long it was supposed to last? Maybe the ghost serpent was onto something. Finally, Zack stopped his pacing, ran his hand through his hair in a frustrated manner, and turned to Zorian. I can't believe I'm doing this, he said. I really can't, but I don't seem to have a choice. Zorian? Yes? Zorian asked, curiously. Was Zack finally going to let him take a look at his mind? Probably, he couldn't imagine what else. I want you to bring me to Xvim again, Zack said, a sour expression on his face. I'm going to need those mind magic lessons after all. Oh, Zorian said, blinking in surprise. He didn't expect that. Yeah. Sure. He wasn't sure whether to be amused or annoyed by this outcome. It wasn't what he had been trying to do by broaching the topic, but at least it was bound to bring plenty of amusement to him in the days to come. Break. The next 3 days proved to be rather frustrating. On the bright side, Zack did not forget about Vayers after a while, so any compulsion he might be laboring under did not extend that far. Unfortunately, that's where the good news ended. Their search for Vayers had gone nowhere. They knew the boy's name, what he looked like and where his home was, but they still couldn't find him. In the end Zack and Zorian blanketed the entire city with divinations, and they still couldn't track him down. Either Veyers was under some heavy anti-divination wards, or he was not anywhere near the city of Syria. To make matters worse, nobody seemed to know anything about the guy, not even the various authorities. Zorian knew from questioning Academy officials and reading their minds when they refused to give him an answer that Veyers had never interacted with the Academy again after his expulsion, even though he was supposed to come and sign some documents to finalize things. The Academy sent a message to Veyers' house to complain about that, but received no response whatsoever. The police, for their part, received no report that the boy was dead or missing, despite the fact Veyers hadn't been seen in weeks. They even tried contacting Noble House Boranova directly to see if they could arrange for a meeting. Sadly, the representatives told them to get lost. Not in those words, admittedly, they were actually rather polite, but they had still made it clear they didn't want to talk to them. All in all, investigating Veyers was proving to be a lot harder than Zorian initially thought it would be. At this point in time, however, Zorian didn't find that either surprising or particularly disappointing. When was anything about this time loop simple? Though it was a long shot, Zorian decided to ask their classmates about Veyers to see if they knew something. At the very least, Benisek was bound to have heard some rumors about the disgraced Boranova heir, even if there was no telling how accurate any of them were. "You're on time for once, I see," Akoya told him as he approached the classroom. She marked his arrival on the attendance sheet she was holding in her hands. A positive sign. What's the occasion? Zorian thought about pointing out he was actually incredibly early, but decided not to. Let her have it her way this once. "I actually wanted to talk to you," he said. "Me?" she asked incredulously, giving him a wide-eyed look. I mean, sure. What did you want to talk about?" "Veyers Boranova," Zorian said. "Him?" she asked in distaste. He felt a twinge of disappointment coming off her. "You really know how to pick a topic, Zorian." "Sorry," he said, genuinely a little remorseful. He probably gave her a bit of false hope he would ask her out or something, if the feelings he got from her were of any indication. Not what he had intended. "I just thought you might know something about him, since you're the class representative and all." "To be honest, I did my best to put him out of my mind," she said. "I can't tell you how glad I was when I heard he got expelled." "Well, about that. Do you know what exactly he did on the hearing to get expelled?" Zorian asked. "No. Nobody does," Akoya said, shaking her head. "I heard people saying he attacked one of the judges, but that's probably rubbish. That's a little too much, even for Veyers." As much as Zorian didn't like the guy, he had to admit there was truth to that. Veyers usually had some restraint around teachers and other people that had power over him, so he probably wouldn't have done something stupid like attacking a judge deciding his own fate. But he wouldn't put it past him, either. "So you've never seen him lately?" Zorian asked. "Never heard about anything about what he did afterwards." "No and no," she answered, giving him a suspicious look. "Why the sudden interest in Veyers?" "Zack wants to talk to him about something, but can't find him," Zorian said. "I agreed to help, so I'm asking people if they know something." He sensed a twinge of annoyance from her when Zack's name came up. Him being suddenly friendly with Zack didn't sit well with her, he could tell, but to her credit she didn't say anything about it. One of these days he really had to ask her why she disliked the boy so much. Maybe his house placed him under private arrest when he got expelled. Akoya offered. It was quite a scandal for them, so they probably don't want him working around in public for a while. At least until things died down a little. Knowing Veyers, he probably couldn't handle people talking behind his back and mocking him. He'd lose his temper and make things worse than they already were. Maybe, Zorian agreed. It was also possible that Veyers was currently a soulless corpse and his house didn't want it to get out for whatever reason. He and Zack were definitely breaking into the Boranova estate at some point if they failed to find any other clues to Veyers' location. It would make sense, but his house didn't seem to care about his outbursts before, so. "Yes," Akoya agreed, nodding. "It's shameful how much they let him get away with. I can't even imagine what my parents would do to me if I tried to behave like that. Getting myself expelled. I would probably be sent away to one of our rural relatives as punishment. I bet Vayers would have learned how to rein in his temper real quick if he had to work at a farm every time he did something stupid. Wow. Akoya's parents were pretty strict apparently. No wonder she turned out the way she did. How do you think your parents would react if you got expelled? Akoya asked curiously. I honestly don't know, Zorian admitted. Truthfully, I think I'd be too afraid to find out. They already don't like me much, and academic success is the only thing I really have going for me in their eyes. If that happened, I'd just gather all my savings and portable belongings and leave the country or something. I wouldn't even bother coming back home. Akoya stared at him in surprise for a moment, at loss how to respond. Ah, she finally said, a little uncomfortably. I see. Don't worry about it, said Zorian. It's all highly theoretical, since there is no way I'm getting expelled like theirs. One last question. This may sound strange, but do you know what Vayers was capable of? Akoya still stared at him thoughtfully for a moment, probably still focused on his previous admission. He was tempted to take a quick peek at her thoughts to see what she was considering, but managed to restrain himself. If he started looking at people's surface thoughts for no reason, where would it all end? Besides, looking at the thoughts of a girl that had a crush on him was probably a bad idea to begin with. I assume you mean magically speaking, she said finally. Zorian nodded. Well, his atrocious behavior aside, I do know he was actually doing well in terms of academics. I'm guessing his house hired some private instructor to teach him, or maybe even did the teaching themselves. I also know he could make fire without chants and gestures, and really easily too, but that is probably not unusual for a Bornova. Zorian nodded. Noble House Bornova was famous for their mastery of fire magic. The orange, slitted eyes that all core members of the house shared hinted that this was a result of some bloodline or enhancement ritual, rather than secret training method, but there was no publicly available information on the specifics of it. Houses were notoriously secretive about such things. Thanking Akoya for her time and patience, Zorian continued on into the classroom. There were still a couple of people he wanted to try his luck with. Break. Hello, Benisek, Zorian said, sitting down next to the boy. Do you mind if I ask you about something? Ah. So the great Zorian finally deigns to come back to his old friend. Benisek said. And here I thought you had replaced me with Zack. If Benisek hadn't been smiling widely when he said that, Zorian might have been actually worried that the boy felt slighted. As it was, he just thanked his luck that Benisek was a very laid-back person who didn't take things personally. It also helped that they weren't terribly close friends, in all honesty. Though that was Zorian's fault more than Benisek's. Don't be so melodramatic, Zorian told him. You can have more than one friend, you know? True, Benisek agreed readily. And you look way happier this year than you usually are, too. Got a girlfriend too, perhaps? He wiggled his eyebrows at Zorian suggestively, causing Zorian to roll his eyes at him. Fine, don't tell me, Benisek scoffed. You know I'll find out on my own soon enough, right? Do you know anything about theirs? Zorian asked him, ignoring the question. Theirs? Benisek asked. Ah, I guess you only now found out why he's not with us this year. I keep forgetting you live in the middle of nowhere and don't really talk to people. Anyway, yeah, he lost his temper on his disciplinary hearing and got expelled. I guess even noble houses have only so much political capital to burn on people like him. Do you know what he actually did? Zorian asked. Benisek didn't. He knew all sorts of speculation about it, such as the one that he set fire to one of the written witness testimonies or the one where he slept with the daughter of some high-ranking academy official and bragged about it during the hearing. They were all heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend sorts of story, though, and Zorian didn't put much stock in them. Unsurprisingly, Benisek had no idea where Vayers could be at the moment. That's not to say he didn't have anything useful to offer in regards to the topic, though. You know, you're not the only person asking for him, Benisek said. I've been hearing there are people discreetly asking people about his whereabouts for a while now. They are offering money to anyone who can prove they've seen him. Huh? Do you know who they are? Zorian asked. I'd already have mentioned it if I did, Benisek said, shrugging. But looking at the most likely suspects, I think it's his house that hired them. If it's not them, it's unlikely they would let someone basically offer a bounty on one of their own. Maybe they don't know, offered Zorian. If I know, there is no way they missed it, Benisek said, shaking his head. I'm just a curious amateur. Noble houses all have actual professionals on their payroll. So Vare's house was looking for him too? Curious. Strange that they could not find him. If Noble House Bornova had its own intelligence network like Benisek claimed, they really should have tracked him down by now. Especially since they were his kin, and thus presumably knew him far better than Zorian ever could. He thanked Benisek for the information and moved on. Break. No, I don't know what Vares did to get expelled, Tanami said. It didn't have to be anything particularly heinous, though. If the academy actually puts you through a disciplinary hearing, they are already thoroughly sick of you. He probably shouted at the judge or something similarly minor, and they decided it was as good an excuse as any. It's really a shame he couldn't control himself more. The last thing his house needs is something like this. Why? Zorian asked curiously. What's wrong with his house? Noble House Bornova is a military house, Tanami said. They suffered a lot in the Splinter Wars. Oh, is this something like what happened to House Nevada? Zorian asked. Were they too robbed of their assets? Ah, you know about that, she said. No, it's not like that. They weathered the weeping without losing too many people, unlike the Nevada. But they still suffered crippling losses in the dissolution of the old alliance, and they're a long way from recovering. Having the designated heir of the house behave like that, that's not going to help the other houses take them seriously again. So House Bornova was weakened, but not so much that people could loot them the way they did in the days. It probably wasn't in their interest for Syria to be destroyed, so why would Vares support the invasion? Perhaps he just doesn't care about his house? Zorian mused out loud. I'd normally scoff at the idea of a noble house heir that doesn't care about the house they had spent their entire life being groomed to take over at some point, but there is clearly something funny going on with Vares, Tanami said. So I don't know. It's possible. While her explanations were interesting, Tanami ultimately couldn't tell Zorian where to find Vares. And since Tanami was the last of his classmates he had planned to ask about the quarrelsome boy, this was the end of his current investigation. It had been surprisingly helpful. He left the class to go find Zack and report his findings. The other time traveler had decided to talk to Xvim about getting mind magic lessons instead of accompanying Zorian to class, but he should be long done by now. Break. Surprisingly, when Zorian actually reached Xvim's office he found that Zack was still inside. That could be either very good or very bad. He didn't have to wait long, thankfully. About 15 minutes after he arrived, the door opened and Zack stepped out of the office. So, how did it go? Zorian asked. Surprisingly bearable, Zack said. He was still kind of insulting, but he didn't outright provoke me this time. Yeah, that's pretty much his real personality as far as I can tell, Zorian said. So did he agree to teach you? Yes, Zack confirmed. It was easy. We hashed out an agreement about that in the first 15 minutes or so. So what have you been doing all this time? Zorian asked curiously. Did he decide to hold your first lesson right then and there? No. Yes, Zack said. Zorian gave him an unamused look. What I mean is, he did give me a brief lesson there at the end, but that's not why it took so long. We spent most of the time arguing about your theory that I have a compulsion placed on me. He thought it was stupid of me not to have someone check up on me right away to see if there is any truth in that. Well, he's right, Zorian bluntly told him. Even if you don't trust me to do it, you should at least go pay one of the certified mind mages in the employ of the Mage Guild to examine you. They are quite reliable. I used their services myself at one point. I actually trust you more than I do experts like those, Zack said. It's just, I don't want anyone using mind magic on me. Having someone looking through my thoughts is a last resort as far as I'm concerned. This compulsion, if it even exists, clearly isn't a pressing issue. It's pretty much rendered irrelevant at this point. I'd rather take the time to learn how to deal with this myself. If you say so, Zorian said. They had this argument before. There was no need for another rehash. In other news, I've been asking around our class about theirs. He told Zack about the scarce few things he found out from questioning their classmates. The most important fact, of course, was that noble house Boranova appeared to be searching for theirs as well. Damn, Zack said. I guess there's no point in breaking into their estate, now, is there? If we still can't track down theirs by the end of the restart, we should still probably do it. Just to make sure, you know? But if they really are looking for him, then he obviously isn't there. I don't understand, Zack said. A person like him is too distinctive to just disappear. His eyes alone ensure most people would note his passage wherever he goes. Yet it's like the earth swallowed him. Maybe he physically walked out of the loop. Zorian frowned. Theoretically, it could happen. The copies of people inside the time loop were every bit as real as their counterparts in the real world. Barring Guardian intervention, it should be possible for a copy to simply step out of the time loop reality and into the real world. I guess it's possible, but we shouldn't jump to conclusions, Zorian said. Let's try to locate him first and see what happens. I don't see what we can try that we haven't done already, Zack shrugged. Aside from breaking into the Boranova estate, that is, and we already know that's probably a dead end. The restart is still young, Zorian said, though he largely agreed with Zack. We'll wait and see if he turns up somewhere. Perhaps his house, with their greater manpower and resources, can track him down for us. It wasn't like they didn't have anything to do in the meantime. Break. Over the next week, both Zorian and Zack slowly advanced their lessons with Xveen and Alanik and kept an eye for theirs. Sadly, the Boranova heir never turned up anywhere and their attempts to find him went nowhere. They even visited many of the nearby settlements near Sioria in their search, only to come back empty-handed. Zack floated the idea that maybe theirs purposely went somewhere far, far away instead of sticking to the city and its surroundings. In that case, they may have more luck in tracking him down at the beginning of the restart, before he had time to get too far from familiar ground. It was as good idea as any they had, but it was of no help to them at the moment. And it also didn't explain why theirs would want to do something like that. Despite their issues with finding theirs, Zorian was happy. They finally had a real clue about Red Robe's identity. Alanik agreed to teach him more about soul magic, and his personal projects were going along nicely. He had even managed to convince Tivan to accept him and Zack as time travelers, despite being very suspicious initially. Initially, the point of making Taven aware of the time loop was so that they could continue with their project of making a perfect training plan for Taven. However, once Taven was actually convinced he was telling the truth, she decided she could also help him by finding him someone of his own skill level to spar with. She claimed it was the best way to really practice combat magic, and that he was going to start stagnating if he only kept fighting training dummies and dungeon monsters. To that end, she first pitted him against her two teammates and then against some of her former student peers that she managed to convince to spar with him. He won about half of the fights. He could have won them all, of course, but using his mental powers or various magic items was against the spirit of the spars. I'm tempted to ask you for a spar, Taven told him one day. But a real one, not these ones where you limit yourself to invocations. But I have a feeling I'd get my butt kicked and I don't think my pride can take that. Yeah, if I took you on with no holding back I'd just batter down your mental barriers and blast your mind into unconsciousness, Zorian said. You don't have the power to take me down before I dismantle your mental defenses. You did once, but not anymore. Yeah, I figured it was like that, she nodded. And don't even get me started on all those bombs you're carrying. I've seen the tests you and Kale did with all those experimental potion grenades. You could probably beat me just by saturating the entire area with those, considering how many of them you made. Are they as expensive as they look? Worse, scowled Zorian. The grenades themselves aren't that bad, but the experimentation needed to refine their recipe into something that effective is murder on my money stash. I'm actually running out of cash these days. Looks like I'll have to start robbing the invaders after all. Taven shook her head ruefully. You say that so casually, she said. I think this time loop thing is having a bad influence on you. Funny, most people think the time loop improved my behavior, said Zorian with a smile. But yes, I guess in some ways I really am getting worse. After a brief discussion about the morality of the time loop and permissible behavior for people aware of the restarts, the two of them said their goodbyes to each other and went to their respective homes. The next morning Zorian and Zack entered Xvim's office, thinking they would be having yet another routine lesson from the man. But they were wrong, because once they arrived, they found the office already occupied by someone. It was Alanik. He and Xvim were casually chatting with each other when Zack and Zorian arrived, sipping tea and generally behaving like long-lost friends that were finally reunited. Ah, Mr. Kaczynski and Mr. Nevada, Xvim said. Just the people we were looking for. Go ahead and sit down. Mr. Zoska and I were just exchanging some very interesting stories. Chapter 058 Questions and Answers. Xvim's office was fairly typical as far as teacher offices went, a small room dominated by a large table and several bookcases, with much of the free space taken up by mysterious stacks of paper that every teacher piled up in their offices for some reason. It was relatively cramped even in normal circumstances. With 4 people inside, it crossed solidly into uncomfortable territory. There weren't even enough chairs for everyone. Though that was admittedly something easily solved with basic conjuration spells. Of course, much of Zorian's current discomfort stemmed from the nature of the meeting he and Zack had stumbled upon, rather than the lack of elbow room. Interaction between Xvim and Alanik could make the rest of this restart very uncomfortable, or even force a premature end to it. Still, the suddenness of this development, as well as the cramped nature of their current environment, greatly amplified the threatening undertones of the meeting, and Zorian couldn't help but wonder how much of it was deliberate. Did Xvim and Alanik purposely arrange for this meeting to happen here and now in order to exert additional psychological pressure on them? Bit of a risky move, if they did. Some people reacted really badly to being cornered. Zorian would not have pulled such a stunt, were he in their place. But no matter. It could be that he was reading too much into it and they just didn't consider things that way. Besides, it wasn't like they were really cornered. Zorian could start an iteration at any time, after all. After exchanging an uncertain look between themselves, Zack and Zorian greeted their 2 teachers back, moved into the room and made themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. As they settled into the room, Zorian found himself wondering what kind of information the 2 men had exchanged. Alanik had probably told Xvim everything he knew about them, but that honestly wasn't much and mostly just proved that Zack and Zorian were keeping some things secret from Xvim. Xvim, on the other hand, had a far more complete picture of what was going on than Alanik. But would he really tell the warrior priest about the time loop? And would the other man believe Xvim, even if he would? Considering the way the 2 teachers were watching him, he reckoned he would find out the answers to those questions in very short order. Surprised to see me here? Alanik asked them challengingly. Yes, Zorian freely admitted. It's very interesting to see you here. I didn't think you and Xvim knew each other. We don't, Alanik shrugged. I grew concerned about some things about you two and knew you would never tell me the truth. So I tracked him down to see if he knew something that could help me. And you just happened to visit him at the time we have a session scheduled with him? Zorian asked, raising his eyebrow at the man. That's some curiously lucky timing. Luck has nothing to do with it. This is actually my 3rd meeting with your mentor, Mr. Kaczynski, Alanik admitted readily. I came here today specifically to meet with you two. Ah, Zorian nodded. All right, let's stop dancing around each other and get to the point, Zack said, apparently not in the mood for verbal sparring. He turned towards Xvim. How much did you tell him? Given the nature of the situation, We felt it would be foolish to try and trick one another, Xvim said. I told Mr. Zosk everything I know about the time loop. A courtesy I wish the two of you had extended to me as well. It is quite obvious at this point that you know far more about it than you've chosen to tell me. A rather poor way of repaying my cooperation and generosity, if I may say. Ouch. Zorian supposed he could add delivering guilt trips to the list of Xvim's many talents. People react very badly if you try to tell them everything, Zack said, completely unapologetic. Unlike Zorian, his experience with Xvim and Alanik was both recent and relatively short. He didn't care much for Xvim's appeal to emotions. I know because I tried it. Give too many details and people either freak out on you or dismiss you as a lunatic. And this was back when I didn't know half the stuff I do today. It's hard enough to convince people the time loop is real. I feel I have been fairly open-minded about this, Xvim noted. It took Zorian several years of mind-numbing shaping exercises for you to take him seriously, Zack said, rolling his eyes. And even then, you tend to stall for weeks if he mucks up his timing or says the wrong thing. And that's Zorian. When I tried to convince you, you didn't entertain my story for a second. Xvim frowned deeply, but said nothing. Okay, this is getting a little too heated, Zorian said, trying to stave off an argument. First things first. Mr. Chow, Mr. Zosk. I apologize for keeping you in the dark. Keeping some of the story secret from you made perfect sense from our perspective, but I can understand why you would feel a little betrayed by our behavior. Alanik snorted derisively. Zorian suddenly remembered something. Actually, do you mind if I ask you something? Zorian said, looking at Alanik. What did Xvim say that convinced you the time loop is real? So you know how to convince me yourselves in the future? Alanik guessed. Zack and Zorian immediately confirmed the supposition. To be honest, I'm still not convinced this is not nonsense. Oh, said Zorian, visibly deflating. Damn. So why the hell are you giving us grief over this if you don't even believe what we're saying? Zack demanded, folding his arms over his chest defensively. Because I can tell you believe what you're saying, Alanik said. So at worst you're delusional, rather than just a bunch of liars. I am somewhat hurt that Xvim here got to hear this tale from you, but you apparently don't think I'm worth convincing. It's not like I would have cut all ties with you if I didn't believe you, you know? I would have just thought you were a little crazy. Zorian gave Alanik an unamused look. You say that, but if I came to you with sole defenses that you yourself had taught me and used time travel as my explanation when you confronted me about it, it would matter a lot whether you believed my story or not, Zorian told him. Ah, so they are my techniques, Alanik said, nodding to himself. I admit it had been bothering me for a while now. It's one of the things that caused me to seek out Xvim. It was just so unlikely that a shifter knew how to teach you some of those things. I did learn some of my soul awareness from a shifter, Zorian said. But the majority of it comes from you. Right. I can see how that could be a bit of a problem, Alanik mused. While a time loop would explain things, there are simpler explanations than time travel for something like that. You could be a powerful mind mage, for example. I am, Zorian admitted. 3 surprised looks were immediately directed his way. Even Zack was caught off guard, probably because he expected him to keep this little factoid a secret at all costs. Hey, they wanted the whole truth. Let them have a taste of it, Zorian shrugged. Yes, I am a powerful mind mage. It's one of the things I had focused on over the restarts. An excellent choice for someone in your situation, Xvim nodded approvingly. Endlessly useful, and it would be quite dangerous to train outside the time loop. Alanik gave Xvim a mildly scandalized look. So, anyway, I come to your place and demonstrate the soul defenses you taught me, Zorian told Alanik, looking him straight in the eye. You ask me how this is possible and I say time travel. You don't believe me and check me for mind magic. As it turns out, I am a mind mage. What now? Things get complicated, Alanik admitted. There was a short pause as everyone considered things in the privacy of their own minds. Well, this didn't go as planned, said Xvim, giving Alanik an annoyed glance. The scarred battle priest shrugged at him unrepentantly. Let us put hypotheticals aside for the moment. I will concede that simply telling us everything may not be as simple as it first appears. Nonetheless, I will have to insist that you try just this once. If you don't, then both of us will withhold our lessons from you for the duration of this restart. Additionally, Alanik quickly added, if you honestly tell us everything, I will tell you what you need to do to stop me from getting suspicious at you in future restarts. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. The carrot and the stick. Truthfully, the threat didn't worry Zorian much. Losing their lessons for the 2 weeks or so left in the restart would be kind of annoying, nothing more. He shared a look with Zack, who shrugged uncaringly. I'm fine with this, Zack said. We already planned on doing something like this in the future, didn't we? Worst case, we get an example of what not to do when we try for real. Thinking about it some more, Zorian had to agree with this. This wasn't nearly as planned and controlled as he wanted the eventual reveal to be, but what else was new? Few things went entirely according to plan, even in the time loop. He may as well tell them everything and see how they react. He opened his mouth to speak, only to be interrupted by Xvim. We would prefer if Zack were to tell the story, if you will, Xvim said. Me? Zack asked in a surprised tone, pointing a finger at his own chest. Why? Zorian would explain it way better than I could. Not only did he figure most of the stuff out before me, he knows you two far better than I do. Perhaps, Alanik conceded. But it is far easier for me to gauge your honesty than it would be to judge Zorian's. Zack shot him an uncertain look. They are not using mind magic on you, Zorian said, shaking his head. I'd be able to tell. But between this and some of Alanik's past comments, it seems likely that he has some supernatural way of checking people's honesty. He then frowned. Something was bothering him. A memory that danced at the edge of his awareness, trying to make itself known. Suddenly, he realized what this reminded him of. Kylie, the priestess that predicted the future, had also claimed she had some way of telling if he was being honest with her. You know, you are not the first priest that claimed he could tell if people are lying to them, Zorian told Alanik. Is this some kind of ability priests possess that I'm not aware of? It's an ability connected to soul magic, Alanik said. But higher-ranking priests are quite often trained in soul magic, so you're not far from the truth. The outer portion of the soul, the aura, reacts to its host's thoughts and emotions to some extent, and those with soul sight can learn how to read and interpret its movements. Since most people have no awareness of their own soul, and thus no control over it, a soul mage can often get far stronger and reliable tells about people than you would get by relying on body language and emanation alone. But I can sense my own soul, so it's not a reliable indicator where I'm concerned, Zorian surmised. Alanik nodded. But I can't actually detect and manipulate my aura to such an extent, Zorian noted. All you've taught me is how to harden it to resist spiritual attacks. And I only have your word for it, Alanik shrugged. All right, I'll do the explanation, Zack said, interrupting their exchange. He waved his hands in front of him, conjuring an illusion of the planet above Xvim's table. This is the world, Zack said, pointing at the gently spinning green and blue sphere. He then shifted his hand to point at a green blob that looked vaguely like Altasia. And this place here is roughly where Sioria is. Beneath the city there is a time magic research facility studying a powerful ancient artifact, likely of divine origin. The researchers think it's an advanced time dilation chamber, and in a way they are right. When activated, it takes a detailed record of everything in existence. And copies it. Zack waved his hands again, and the ghostly planet forked into two identical spheres, one floating to the left of the original, and the other to the right. The difference was that the left copy was no longer spinning, standing still as if frozen in time, while the right one was rotating madly like a spinning top. The copy of the world exists in its own pocket dimension that is under tremendous time dilation. From the point of the copy people living in this copy world, the original world is frozen between moments. 100 years passes in a fraction of a second. Not that they know this. The only tell that the world is a copy bound to its own pocket dimension is that the spiritual planes have been cut off from the material world. From the corner of his eye, Zorian saw Alanik suddenly stiffen. Time does not flow normally within the copy world, Zack continued. He adjusted the illusion again, altering the right planet slightly. It still spun, but there was a subtle, stuttering quality to it now, since every couple of rotations it reverted to its initial position before fully completing the spin. Instead of always going forward in time, the world is periodically reverted to its original state. Everything is utterly undone, the land and its people constantly recreated from that initial record of the real world that was used to make the copy world in the first place. Time repeats itself over and over, month after month after month. From the perspective of someone living in such a world, it would be like they are trapped in a time loop. Zack leaned back in his conjured chair and gave Xvim and Alanik a dramatic stare. Zorian had a feeling Zack was kind of enjoying this, despite his earlier complaints. As a matter of fact, there is someone like that, Zack announced. 3 of them, in fact. 3? Alanik asked, raising his eyebrow. 3, Zack nodded. There was supposed to be only one, a single person aware of the repetition, a mysterious marker stamped onto his soul to make sure he retains his memories through the restarts. Zorian thinks that is me. If so, I do not remember being this chosen one. A second person found a way to retain awareness across restarts and messed with my mind, deleting many of my memories. Much later on, I decided to take on an ancient lich head-on in battle, and he tried to blend my soul with Zorian's as punishment. That got him a curious look from both Xvim and Alanik, but Zack didn't try to elaborate on that, choosing to instead finish his story. We survived, but the experience granted Zorian a functional version of my marker, granting him awareness of the time loop, Zack said. Unfortunately, it also eventually motivated the second time traveler to leave the copy world. For reasons I won't go into right now, this means nobody else can leave without cheating the system somehow. And the fake world is running out of power and will collapse in little more than 4 years. And there you have it, Zack finally concluded, erasing the 2 illusionary planets with a wave of his hand and directing a bright smile at the 2 teachers. We are all copies of the real thing, living in a looping, hyper-accelerated copy of the real world. A copy that will soon disappear, taking us all with it. Nothing you do really matters, and unless we can figure out a way to break the system, nothing we do will matter in the end, either. Zorian, did I miss anything? Zorian suppressed the urge to roll his eyes. Just a million details, that's all. And did he really have to phrase things so provocatively? It would have already been hard to convince them, there was no need to make the job harder. But fine, he would play Zack's game. An Ebeson invasion force is going to invade Seoria at the day of the summer festival. The cult of the World Dragon intends to release a primordial in the center of the city while the defenders are distracted. The mayor of Nyazovdvari is a necromancer and intends to harvest all of the souls killed in the conflict in some mad scheme to resurrect his dead wife as a lich and legalize necromancy, Zorian enumerated blandly. That isn't strictly time loop related, so I was going to bring it up afterwards, Zack said dismissively. A long, uncomfortable silence descended upon the room. Both Xvim and Alanik seemed at loss for words, simply staring at the 2 of them in indecision and occasionally sharing strange looks between each other. Zorian imagined that was how he and Zack had looked when they first stumbled into their meeting, so this was kind of poetic punishment in his eyes. So, Zack said, clapping his hands. Any questions? Break. Several hours and many, many questions later, Xvim and Alanik decided they had had enough and stopped the meeting. They didn't get everything in the end. Not even close, but at the very least they knew the major details surrounding the time loop mechanism and invasion of Seoria. Damn, that was exhausting, Zack told him afterwards as they wandered the city. So much for your nice, relaxing restart to calm down and plan, huh? Between this and the Vayers thing, this is turning into a pretty exhausting month. I've had worse ones, Zorian said. But yes, this was not quite what I had in mind when I told you I wanted a restart or 2 to unwind a bit. Do you think it will be worth it in the end, at least? Zack asked. They looked rather incredulous towards the end there. It's the invasion stuff, Zorian said. If I hadn't lived through it, I'd have trouble believing it too. It sounds almost as far-fetched as the time loop itself. I'm not worried about that, to be honest. Unlike the time loop, the stuff about Ibison's cult of the World Dragon and Sadamir is pretty easy to confirm. I just hope they won't panic and do something stupid when they confirm that part of the story. In the end, they had to meet with Xvim and Alanik 2 more times in the next 4 days, giving further explanations and details to their 2 increasingly nervous teachers. Like Zorian feared, they fixated more on the invasion of the city and Sadamir's plots than on the time loop. He understood, but was kind of annoyed anyway. Another thing that was annoying was that Alanik, despite his earlier promise, didn't tell them how to stop his future iterations from getting suspicious at them. His explanation that he wanted to check things first was kind of understandable at the beginning, but now Zorian was starting to feel a little cheated. He was therefore pleasantly surprised when Alanik came to him on the 5th day of their first talk to give him the promised information. So we just have to claim we're junior members of this shady church organization of yours and that's it? Zorian asked the man incredulously. You would have just accepted a claim like that? The Mycelian order is not shady, Alanik told him with a small glare. Sure, Alanik, sure. It's just not well known. And of course I would not just accept it. But neither would I drop everything to confirm your identity, especially if you forge a legitimate-looking letter of recommendation and give me something else to focus on. Like Sadamir, for example. If I tell you about the mansion, everything blows up soon afterwards, Zorian said, shaking his head. I'm pretty sure I already told you that. So don't tell my future self about the mansion, then, Alanik shrugged. Use some other piece of information. There is no shortage of crimes that man is guilty of. I'm sure we can work something out in the coming days. Fair enough, Zorian nodded. He took a long look at Alanik, and noticed how tired and disheveled he looked. It didn't look like he was getting a lot of sleep these days. So, does this mean you believe us about the time loop? Alanik released a long-suffering sigh. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said. But I figure there is no harm in helping you with this. If there is no time loop, the trick will be useless to you. If there is a time loop, well, you and Zack seem to be our only hope for a decent ending to all this. At this point Amaya found them talking and gave Zorian an earful about being a poor host. He hadn't offered Alanik anything to eat or drink. Rather surprisingly, she then managed to talk Alanik into joining them for dinner. He didn't expect that. After prodding him a bit, Alanik admitted that he was so busy checking up on things he and Zack told him that he didn't have a proper meal since yesterday. Amaya was terribly smug about the whole thing. What was that you said? She asked with a smirk on her face. It was a rhetorical question, of course. They both knew what he had said. Something about how he was obviously not interested and how it was a pointless courtesy. Seems that old people like me do know a thing or two about being a proper host, eh? Zorian let her have her little victory. She did turn out to be correct in this case, after all. In any case, Alanik was back the next day, though he didn't want to eat this time Zorian had offered. Amaya couldn't say anything now and instead wanted the two of them to visit a cave about something. Are you sure we shouldn't have taken Zack with us as well? Zorian asked as they put some distance from Amaya's house. I want to discuss shifters and the primordial, Alanik said. From what I understood of your story, Zack has nothing to contribute there that he didn't hear from you first. I can't see a reason to bring him along. Unless you think he'll be insulted he's left out of the talks? Zorian considered it. If they were doing something exciting, like fighting monsters and the like, then maybe. As it was, Zack was already getting annoyed by their talks with Xvim and Alanik, complaining how much time they take and how boring they were. He probably won't care much that Zorian did this without him. No, probably not, he said, shaking his head. I'll just fill him in later about what we talked about. Good. Let's hurry to the edge of the city so we can teleport to the cave's place, Alanik said. "There is no need," Zorian said with a self-satisfied smile. "Let's just find a deserted alley and I'll teleport us out straight out of the city. The teleport beacon hasn't been able to stop me for quite some time now." If Alanik was surprised by his claim, he did not show it. Zorian supposed it was a minor thing after the revelations in the past few days. They found a sufficiently isolated place and soon arrived not far from Lucave's house, just outside the village he lived in. He spoke with Alanik while they walked, the warrior priest telling him about some of the theories he had thought up over the past few days. Most of them centered on the release of the primordial from its prison dimension. "So you think this whole time loop was created to stop the release of this thing?" Zorian said. "I can see where you're coming from. On one hand, both the time loop and the primordial release ceremony are clearly reliant on the planetary alignment to work. It's not a coincidence that those two are happening at roughly the same time. On the other hand, the time loop did start a month earlier than it was supposed to, for some reason. Each restart just happens to end at the time of the primordial's release. And on top of it all, the one time the primordial was released prematurely, the time loop immediately reset itself on its own. Seems like an open and shut case to me," Alanik pointed out. "Nothing is open and shut about this time loop business," Zorian sighed. "If you say so," Alanik said. "We're almost there. Let me do the talking in the beginning." As it turned out, this was not the first time Alanik talked to Lucave about the topic. He had already told his friend about some of the things he found out from Zorian, specifically, the part where a group was trying to sacrifice shifter children in order to set a primordial loose into the world, and asked for his advice on tracking down the sacrifices before the ritual takes place. Lucave asked a lot of questions, and eventually Alanik grew annoyed and decided to just bring Zorian along on his next visit to clarify things. Not that Zorian could truly help Lucave understand the issue, since he didn't truly understand it himself. Primordial essence was almost as big of a mystery to him as it was to Lucave. "I don't understand why they're killing all these children," Lucave complained. "If the primordial essence is just a key to access the prison dimension, you'd think they needed only a drop of essence to work the magic. They could just, I don't know, bleed them a little." "A bridge, not a key," Zorian said. Not that he truly understood what the difference was, but Sadamir had phrased it like that, so it was probably important. Apparently that means they need as much primordial essence as possible for the ritual to work, so they're draining the victims of everything they have. Partial extraction of life force just doesn't cut it. Even if it wasn't necessary, they would have likely killed them in the end, Alanik said. "You don't set up a ritual like that and then leave witnesses afterwards." In the end, Alanik didn't get what he wanted out of the meeting. He was trying to find a way to track down the sacrifices before the ritual began, as well as a way to locate the exact position of the anchor point of the primordial prison, something more accurate than Zorian's inside the hole, somewhere. Unfortunately, the only advice Lucave could give him in the end was to try and contact the local shifter tribes for help. Alanik then left his friend's house, but Zorian stayed behind. He wanted to talk to Lucave about his idea to accelerate his training with the help of transformation potions. The idea was to transform into magical beings with useful special abilities and then use the experiences gained in that form to upgrade his own abilities. He was especially interested in creatures that possessed a form of advanced magic perception, since he was unhappy with his rate of growth there. Xveen claimed he was advancing along adequately there, but Zorian didn't really have time to be merely adequate. Lucave gave him both the good news and bad news. The good news was that his idea was solid. It was a known training aid, just one that was sparingly used due to extreme expense of such transformation potions. Not an issue for him and Zack. The bad news was that transformation potions like the ones he wanted couldn't be found on the open market. This was the sort of thing you needed good connections and various licenses to obtain, especially in the sort of quantity he would need. Fortunately, Lucave was perfectly capable of making potions like that and willing to help Zorian out. All Zorian had to do was bring Lucave an appropriate magical creature in good enough condition and pay a moderate fee, and the man was willing to make a transformation potion or two out of it. Any leftovers not used to make Zorian's potions would belong to Lekave. Zorian had a feeling he was being thoroughly cheated there, but at the end of the day it was just money, and he should probably be glad that Lekave was willing to essentially break the law for his sake. He still had an urge to learn how to make transformation potions on his own so he wouldn't have to rely on the man. Something to think about, at least. He made a note in the list of ideas he was making in his free time and moved on. Break. The next couple of days were surprisingly peaceful. Alanik and Xvim agreed to continue teaching them, cutting down on their usual questioning of them whenever they saw them. They were still clearly keeping in contact with each other, discussing the time loop and the invaders, but for now they kept their conclusions to themselves and plotted something in the background. Zorian was a bit concerned about that, but not enough to lose sleep over it. Their minds were sufficiently open for his empathy to work on them, and they didn't feel like they had any malicious intentions towards him and Zack. Zorian wasn't doing anything substantive during this time, his motivation suffering due to his recent dealings with Xvim and Alanik. He tried his hand at drawing again to pass the time, messed around with theoretical spell formula and learned some new spells from Zack. He also let Taven talk him into several rounds of physical combat. Normally he would never agree to something like that, no matter how bored, but recently his golem-making skills had progressed enough that his lack of fighting skills was becoming an issue. He couldn't make golems fight any better so long as he only knew the crudest basics of normal fighting. After talking to Edwin, his fellow golem enthusiast in the class, he had found out that Edwin was rather reluctantly taking martial arts lessons to preempt this very problem. That was how he met Nain, actually. And no, there was no solution except to learn how to fight the hard way. Taven absolutely demolished him, of course. She was superior to him in strength, technique and practical experience. It was not nearly as bad as he feared, though. She actually toned down the violence to something manageable and gave him some solid advice about what he was doing wrong. She still kind of sucked as a teacher. Zorian was pretty sure the student wasn't supposed to end the lessons covered in bruises. He should look into hiring a proper fighting instructor someday. Maybe Nain knew a good one. Another thing to add to his list. Break. It was another quiet day. Most of Amaya's household, plus Zack and Taven, were gathered around the kitchen table, playing a game of cards. Since there were only so many players that could join a game at once, and since they were horrible players on their own, Kenna and Kirill were each attached to another person. Kirill was attached to Zorian, of course, since he was her brother. She gave terrible advice and complained loudly when he didn't listen to her, giving clues to other players as to what his hand looked like. Kenna, on the other hand, was sitting in Amaya's lap. Kale was away currently, negotiating some kind of deal with one of the alchemists in the city, so Amaya decided to take her under her wing while she played. The little girl mostly just watched the game, but occasionally Amaya prompted her for advice and she dutifully suggested a card by silently pointing at it with her finger. Amaya always played the suggested card, no matter how terrible the suggestion. And she was still doing better than Zorian and Kirill. He wondered if it would be okay if he started glancing at people's thoughts from time to time. It was cheating, but he had Kirill dragging him down and they didn't, so it kind of evened out, didn't it? He studied his opponents a little. Right now, Zack was solidly winning the game. He was kind of suspicious about that, but if his fellow time traveler was cheating somehow, Zorian couldn't figure it out. Amaya was second, despite the occasional help she solicited from Kenna. Taven was in third place, but she had a solid 3-point lead on him. Considering his current cards and the confidence all three of them radiated, he doubted that was going to change in this game. "Play this," Kirill demanded, pointing at a card. Another poor choice on her part. He played it anyway. Let her see the consequences of her folly, for once. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Seeing how this was shaping up to be another loss for him, he immediately handed the cards to Kirill and volunteered to check up on it. As it turned out, the visitor was Xvim. Apparently his mini-vacation was over. "Greetings, Mr. Kaczynski," Xvim said. "Am I interrupting anything?" "No, Not really, Zorian said. Well, sort of. But it's nothing really important, so don't worry about it. Please come in. Surprisingly, Xvim didn't want to jump straight to business like Zorian thought he would. Instead, he accepted Amaya's offer of something to drink, tea, and took the time to talk to everyone in the house except for Kana, who didn't talk. He got especially interested in Taven, since he realized halfway through their talk that Zorian had told her about the time loop. Zorian almost had a panic attack when he realized this. He was virtually certain that he was on the verge of another crisis, and would spend the next few days running damage control. He never actually told Taven and Kale the whole truth about the time loop, after all. Thankfully, Xvim seemed more interested in the training regimen he was devising for Taven and his help with Kale's alchemy research, rather than her opinion on time loop mechanics. Eventually he managed to get Xvim alone for a while and explained to him that she and Kale only know a part of the truth, and that he would appreciate if things stayed that way. Xvim didn't seem to approve, but promised to respect his wishes. Xvim also used this opportunity to ask why he was never informed about Kale and Taven during their talks, and Zorian admitted he totally forgot to tell Xvim and Alanik about those two. It wasn't really relevant to the whole truth in his mind. Xvim accepted this explanation without complaint, but still wanted to talk to them about their perspective on things. In the end Zack and Xvim barricaded themselves in Kale's alchemy lab to have a proper talk in peace. So, more questions, huh? Zack said with distaste. Yes. But not the kind you are thinking of, Xvim told them. I actually came here to talk to you about your plans for the future. Well, they are still in the process of being made, Zorian admitted. You have to understand, it has only been a single restart since we found out we're trapped in this world. The lead up to that was very stressful, and this restart was supposed to be something of a short vacation. I have been slowly assembling some kind of plan in my head, but it's still very rough. Currently, Zorian's plan for moving forward was very simple. Use time loop cheats to amass a lot of funds. Recruit various experts across the city and perhaps the country and beyond as their researchers, investigators and teachers. Take over the Iranian criminal contacts and see if they could be harnessed for something useful. Trade with Iranian settlements for their mind magic secrets. Raid Mage Guild records and various magical libraries, including the Academy Library for Information and Forbidden Magic. I think you should use your mind magic more, Xvim told him. What? Zorian frowned. That wasn't advice he heard very often. What do you mean? I mean that you should attack mages and steal their secrets with your mind magic, Xvim told him bluntly. Not only spells and training methods, but also things you could use to convince them to cooperate with you. Are you sure you should be giving out that kind of advice? Zack asked him incredulously. You have very little time to catch up to Red Robe and find a way to reach the real world, Xvim said. Even for me, the enormity of the task in front of you would be rather daunting. You should use the tools you are given. Wordlessly, Xvim reached into his jacket and handed Zorian a thick notebook. Opening it, Zorian found it full of names, addresses and accompanying short notes. There are people that should be able to help you, whether to increase your skills or track down some crucial piece of information or material component. Not all of them will be willing to help you out, however, and sometimes the things you need most out of them, they will not be willing to part with. In such cases, I suggest you employ more aggressive, even illegal persuasion methods. By the end of Xvim's explanation, the notebook felt incredibly heavy in Zorian's hands. It was just a trick of the mind, he knew, but it didn't help him feel better about it. You have no idea what you are asking of me, Zorian told him bitterly, fighting the urge to throw the notebook at Xvim. Probably not, no, Xvim agreed. I was never in your kind of situation in my entire life, and I have serious doubts I would have risen to the challenge if I was. Especially at your age. You're asking me to attack people who have done nothing wrong, just because they have something I want, Zorian said. That kind of stuff changes you. I couldn't even do that to giant spiders without feeling terrible afterwards. And really, I don't want to be the sort of person who became used to stuff like that. Then feel free to ignore my advice, Xvim said. I'm only giving you advice. I have no power over you. If you feel you can do without reaching for methods like these, or that going along with it would cost you something you cannot afford to lose, then don't do it. It's as simple as that. There was a short silence where Xvim and Zorian stared at each other, Zorian clutching the notebook so tightly in his hand his fingers went white. Zack seemed to be at loss what to do, watching them both uneasily as if waiting for a fight to break out. Eventually, Xvim broke the standstill by reaching out and pushing Zorian's hand, still clutching the notebook, towards Zorian's chest. Keep the notebook, whatever your decision, Xvim said. It will be useful regardless. Following that, Xvim politely excused himself and left. After he was gone, Zorian looked at the notebook one last time before slamming it loudly on top of Kale's alchemy table in frustration. Worst vacation ever, he announced bitterly. Zack said nothing. Tobe continued.